Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 4 of the Bait Breakdown, presented by the Tackle Talk podcast, a multi-part series where we take an in-depth look at the 4 major types of a bass's natural forage: baitfish, crawfish, aquatic insects, and reptiles and amphibians. On today's episode, we cover all things reptiles and amphibians, including frogs, turtles, salamanders, and snakes, with our special guest, Dr. Matt Cross. Episode 4 of the Bait Breakdown starts right now.
Hello, everybody. I'm Bill Dance, and you're listening to Tackle Talk.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to another very special episode of the Tackle Talk podcast, our 4th and final episode of our 4-part series, The Bait Breakdown. These 4 conversations, as always, will be brought to you with no ad interruptions after the beginning of the episode, so we do have to thank a couple people before we start. First and foremost, American Legacy Fishing. ALF is the title sponsor of the Tackle Talk podcast for 4 main reasons. You know them by now. They have a huge selection of high-quality fishing gear. They have extremely fast shipping times. They have the best prices that you'll find anywhere, and they have hands down the best customer service in the entire fishing industry. If you're looking for new or used gear, go check out American Legacy Fishing and see for yourself why they have one of the most loyal fan bases in the entire fishing world. If you're looking for anything from G. Loomis, Dobbins, Daiwa, Shimano, 13, Lew's, Megabass, anything from those brands and more, go check out www.americanlegacyfishing.com today. I enjoy talking to you guys. I enjoy hearing your stories of buying through ALF for the first time or buying through ALF for the 100th time, right? And your great experiences that you have with the boys over at ALF. They are going to treat you right. They have great gear, great selection, great shipping, great everything. Your experience with them will be second to none. So go check them out. Head over to www.americanlegacyfishing.com and see for yourself why everyone is raving about ALF. Thank you to the folks over at ALF for making this entire series and the podcast itself possible. Okay, let's get into today's episode. The past 3 episodes, we have covered baitfish with Shan O'Gorman, crawfish with Dr. Zach Loafman, aquatic insects with Dr. Sally Entrican, and today we complete the 4-part series with reptiles and amphibians with herpatologist Dr. Matt Cross. So we talk with Dr. Cross about anything and everything from the reptile and amphibian category that fits into a bass's natural forage. So that is frogs, tadpoles, baby turtles, snakes, salamanders, and a lot more. So let's jump into this 4th and final episode with herpetologist Dr. Matt Cross. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are here with Dr. Matt Cross today to talk amphibians and reptiles for part 4 of the Bait Breakdown. Dr. Cross, thank you so much for taking your time and joining us today.
Not a problem. Thank you. You can just call me Matt. It's fine.
Matt. All right. Well, cool. For starters, do you want to give the listeners, I guess, a quick background on kind of you, who you are, where you're coming from, and how you got into this sort of crazy world of biology and herpetology?
Yeah. So I'm a herpetologist, conservation biologist here at the Toledo Zoo. My folks will say, my dad caught me a garter snake when I was about 3. And it was kind of just downhill ever since, depending on how you look at it. I've all my life I've been fascinated by, creepy crawly things, the things other people run away from. And I've just been very fortunate enough to be able to turn that into a career. So spent more time in college than I should have. I have a master's degree in conservation biology. Also have a master's degree in GIS, which is, mapping and that kind of thing. And then I got my PhD in ecology. The whole time I've been working on Massasauga rattlesnakes, responses to management, box turtles, how they work with prescribed fires and their spatial ecology. And then here at the zoo, there's just a lot of different projects we work on. We've got a large scale, statewide turtle survey that we're working on. We also do surveys for rare snakes. I work with our other conservation programs. We've got the hellbender rearing. We raise sturgeon. We raise turtles here. And then I also was co-chair of Ohio Partners in Amphibian Reptile Conservation, OPARC, for a couple of years there. So that's the lengthy version of I love snakes, reptiles, and amphibians. I love what I do, and just happy to be doing it.
I was about to ask, is there one of these creepy crawlies, as you say, that you have a soft spot for above all the else? Obviously, you kind of hinted at snakes a little bit. Is that what it is?
Yeah, snakes were kind of like my gateway to this whole thing.
Okay.
These days, I do more work with turtles.
Okay.
But yeah, snakes have to be my favorite.
Were you like the kid that had 12 pet snakes growing up and everything?
I wasn't allowed to have them as pets when I was a kid, but then when I got to college, yeah, I kind of got myself in trouble there for a while. I had a lot at one point, but then as I started to realize that it was hard to, it was an expensive grocery bill paying for all the things I had. So kind of whittle it down to just a snake and a turtle now.
Well, that's cool. Well, today, obviously, you're the right man for the conversation, because today we're going to be talking about reptiles and amphibians and how they factor into a bass's natural forage, the food chain, stuff like that. And for me specifically as a bass angler, I think the four that we'll probably focus on are going to be frogs, snakes, salamanders, and turtles. I think there are probably some other stuff out there, but as far as normal things that you would probably see a bass feed on or think of when it comes to a bass's natural forage, I think in this domain, those are probably the four that we'll talk about. So to set us up for this conversation first, can you explain to us, again, simpleton bass anglers, what the difference is between reptiles and amphibians and where frogs, snakes, salamanders, turtles fall on that spectrum?
Yeah. So, the basic differences are, just kind of your biological things. Amphibians, they're going to have what we call permeable skin. A lot of their skin, water, whatnot, passes right through the skin very easily. That's why a lot of our amphibians, especially like leopard frogs and that kind of thing, have been used as indicator species, because anything that's in the environment in the water passes right through their skin, and can start affecting them. So they have permeable skin. It's going to be slimy. Almost all of them have poison glands to some degree. Not like it's going to kill you or make you throw up, but it might, it might taste bad, or it's designed to make things not want to chew on them. And they also, amphibians, I guess from the standpoint of like an angler, they have a pretty a close tie to water. They can't be too far from water because of that permeable skin. They lose water rapidly through their skin. So that's why you see them breeding in or around ponds, under logs. They need that moisture. Their eggs are going to be gelatinous, and so the eggs themselves can't survive that long without a kind of source of water or moisture. So they have a very strong tie to the water, whereas reptiles, you start to see a little bit more diversity in where they can go. They have a shelled egg, which allows them to, give birth or lay eggs, they pretty much release themselves from that with that water tie. They've got scaly skin, so that helps with that water loss. So those would be the biggest differences, in just layman's terms between the reptiles and amphibians. Are going to be tolerance to water loss, and yeah.
So frogs, salamanders, amphibians, snakes, turtles, reptiles.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Got it. Cool. Makes sense. So, and obviously we'll talk about some of this too when we talk about their natural habitats, because obviously that makes sense, right? Frogs and salamanders, you are not going to see too far away from a water source, if not directly in the water source all the times. Snakes, obviously you can see miles from a water source, depending on the type of snake. And then turtles sort of the same way. They get, on their wayward way, and you see one in the road and you're like, how did you get 4 miles away from a water source? Cool. So the obvious first one for us as bass guys is frogs. Frogs, thank goodness, thank God for frogs, because there's nothing better in the world than a absolutely primal topwater strike on a soft, hollow body frog on a summer day. So that is just obviously like creme de la creme of bass fishing is that topwater strike on a frog. But let's dive into a frog's biology first. So first, I guess, kind of probably taking us back to elementary school at this point, but the life cycle of a frog. Well, for this conversation, let's just say like American bullfrog, just kind of a normal thing that will be around everybody. We obviously know they go through the egg, the tadpole, kind of froglet, and then frog phase, but how long do each of those cycles usually last, or what does this cycle, I guess, look like in terms of time?
It's going to vary by species, and it's funny using bullfrogs as an example, because in a lot of cases, bullfrogs stay as tadpoles for 2 seasons.
Really?
That's why, like, if you see like these giant tadpoles out there, those are generally going to be your bullfrogs. They're bigger to begin with, but in instances, they will spend an entire year and a half or 2 years as tadpoles, whereas a lot of other species, it's pretty cyclic. They're these boom and bust breeders. They get together early in the season. they breed in mass. You can find them by any body of water. Then your tadpoles, and then again, it depends on when they breed in there, because I feel like you've got some of your, I forget the name of the group of the frogs right now, but some of them are going to be more your early spring breeders, like your wood frogs, your spring peepers. And then, I see bullfrogs, setting up their territories and doing their chuggarum a little bit later in the spring. So for most species, I would expect like your green frogs or leopard frogs, the ones that are a little bit less likely to spend that extended period of time as a tadpole.
Okay.
Springtime, they're going to be breeding. They're going to be laying their eggs, tadpoles, and then pretty soon, pretty close to around August is when you'll see them start to. You see like a boom of like lots of little frogs. Same with toads. You'll start to see the toads hopping through. I think mowing your lawn, if you're near a wooded area, you're always you can tell when it's toad time of year, when they've made that transition from tadpoles to little froglets. But it's gonna vary a lot by the species, but I'd say our pond species, the ones you'd be seeing most, especially in Ohio, like the green frogs, leopard frogs. They're going to be breeding in the spring. You get those big egg masses. They'll hatch into tadpoles and develop, and you're talking around August, September. That they're you got little frogs running around.
What's your average, like, I guess, complete lifespan of a leopard frog versus a bullfrog, or do we even know that?
I'd have to look that one up. That would
okay.
That's not.
I didn't know if this was like is this frog a year old? Is this frog 10 years old? Like, because some of that stuff will surprise you.
Yeah, in general, I'd say the frogs that like our bullfrogs might live a little longer, but a lot of these frogs are really easy prey for a lot of these these aquatic predators, these terrestrial things, birds. I wouldn't expect their lifespan to be much longer than like 2 to 5 years, and I think 5 might be pushing it. But that is something I would have to check.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing too, right? If a frog's a journeyman and it's making it 7 to 10 years, like he's either got a really good hiding spot or or something's going on. But yeah, it's always what kind of blew my mind was like, obviously being a bass guy, smallmouth around here, for instance, like, you catch an 18, 19, 20 inch smallmouth. That's a trophy smallmouth around here. And that fish is, I would have never guessed it until I did research, but it's like, 10, 11, 12 years old. And you're like, the fact that, because it around here, that's the growth cycle, right? It takes a smallmouth, again, almost better half of a decade to get to that trophy. Like the state of Ohio has what we call like the Fish Ohio program, where they set these guidelines. I guess most of them are on length, where it's like the state of Ohio will call an 18-inch smallmouth inland a trophy smallmouth. Up in Lake Erie, it's 20 inches. So it's really nice we have these kind of guidelines to go off of. But then you get to doing your research and you're like, holy cow, that smallmouth to get to the minimum size is like 9, 10, 8, 9, 10 years old. You're like, holy moly. But yeah, obviously frogs not living that long. But do you normally see, like, I guess, because you hinted at a bullfrog is going to stay in that tadpole stage longer, would we assume that a bullfrog has a longer life expectancy than just a normal, like, leopard frog?
I think so. But again, that's one that I'd have to do a little bit of looking into.
Okay.
My gut tells me that the bullfrogs they live a little bit longer. Those bigger ones are going to be around longer. They got that extended life, that extended life in the tadpole stage. So, I'd expect them to live a little bit longer than like your average green frog.
For all intents and purposes, for vulnerability, when in a frog's life cycle would we say they're probably most vulnerable to an aquatic predator like a bass? Like, do we think it's, and again, this is an opinion here, but obviously, like, is it tadpole where there's millions of them swimming around and they're all aquatic, or is it adult frog because it's a bigger target? Like, do they have defense mechanisms?
So the defense is going to be, like I said earlier, most amphibians have poison glands, so they probably taste a little bit funky, but as you said, bass love them. So I've always actually been curious, what they taste like to other animals. The fact that they have these poison glands doesn't seem to deter things from eating them. So in terms of their most vulnerable stage, so the tadpole stage, they don't really, they're soft, squishy, they don't have much of a defense. They can swim pretty fast. The adult stage, their mobility is going to be more, they're hopping, swimming, they're pretty adept in the water, but I think we've all like hand caught frogs before. I've caught a lot. I've caught a lot of frogs by hand. I've caught very few fish by hand.
Right.
So
good point. Yeah.
they're, the frogs, their big thing is going to be, staying close to shore because the water provides them refuge from, birds and terrestrial predators, and then not wanting to go out too deep where they're exposed to those, to the bigger fish. Tadpoles especially are going to be, close to the shore if they're out there. And so, they might not be, it's kind of hard to gauge where they would sit, tadpoles, especially on like the menu for, I think a lot of these species, if they have preferences, but they'll eat anything that they can get their mouth on, so, in terms of defenses, just their mobility is going to be the main thing there, trying to stay in these areas that have a lot of structure so they can hide, and being able to escape. Like those are the big two for any of these prey species, is hiding and then being able to escape. And so if you were looking for the most vulnerable stage for, like, say, beyond the tadpole, it'd be that younger, kind of like that new frog, that froglet you were saying, because not a lot of experience, might be a little more inclined to, go a little farther than shore. Your big frogs, they've been around a while. They're not going to be stupid enough to go, swim out in the middle of the lake.
Right. So then, again, it's all subjective, but for the most part, that froglet, I guess, a stage of that, if they're mating in the spring, this is probably like a late summer, early fall time frame where a lot of those frogs are moving to that stage.
Yeah. And again, it's going to depend on species, where you are in the latitude and that kind of thing. So, and that's what's so hard. I think what's thinking about this now, I never thought this from like an angler perspective, but like so much local variation, that I'd say a big caveat with anything I'd say today is that, you guys know better where you are, and what we're talking about is not going to be the same. It's not going to hold true every single place.
What's interesting is earlier you mentioned, like, obviously the tadpoles are going to be closer to the shore. There are times a year here, it's usually like midsummer, like a hottest time of summer, where we'll be in a river or in a creek, and it's just that time of year where you look at the, this far away from shore, and there's just all you can see are those black dots and just those tadpoles just littering the shoreline too. And it kind of makes you think, obviously they're up there because that is shallow water, they're almost as protected there as they can be anywhere else, because they're in too shallow of a water for predatory fish. They're in water, so they're avoiding a lot of those land predators as well. But yeah, there's times a year where you can just go in around here and you can grab a handful of 50 tadpoles, and But the interesting part I wanted to ask here too is, earlier you mentioned toads, and obviously I think there are probably some differences between frogs and toads. The areas that I've seen, those grab a handful of things, those are very toad-heavy areas. Do toads end up as tadpoles too? Because then obviously you see toads in areas where there's no water that I could pinpoint and say, where did you spend your tadpole year, I guess. So how does that work?
So toads are kind of like one of those exceptions with the amphibian rule. They have drier skin, so they can tolerate water loss better than frogs, but they still aren't as good as something like a snake in terms of losing water. So your regular frogs, like your pond frogs, they're going to dry out really quickly. They need to stay by the water. Toads tend to be more of like an upland wooded area species, but so they're going to get their moisture the same way a lot of these salamanders do, by like hunkering down in the duff, like, in these humid areas and leaves. But then, toads are also those like early spring explosive breeders who, I've found, a bunch of toad tadpoles in 2-track ruts that are filled up with water.
Yeah.
So they're just all over the place, like any port in a storm, so the toads will generally, you can find them a little bit farther away from water, but they don't quite have that same kind of water dependency as your other frogs.
Right. So they're more looking for moisture, or need moisture to survive. A bullfrog or a pond frog needs an actual stagnant body of water somewhere. Yeah, they can. They can go away. Yeah, they're going to dry out a lot quicker, and so they're not going to roam as far. Got it. So I want to talk colors for a second. So For normal, again, frogs are one of those things you can go on the internet and you can find a frog of any color and any variety. But for around here, I guess like normal North American frogs, do those frogs ever change color for any reason, whether it be season, mating, camouflage, anything like that? Or for the most part, are our frogs around here just kind of the same color pretty much regardless of when you're looking at it, and then you're just looking at the different colors of individual frogs and the individuality there?
Right. So for the most part, our frogs here are going to be the same color. The only frog that really changes color is going to be the gray tree frog. And they've got camouflage. They can go from green to gray. That's not something I would expect to find, breeding in your ponds. They're more up in the woods. So the frogs that you'd be encountering mostly when you're out fishing, they're going to be the generic color, green on top, lightish on the bottom. I forgot what that counter shading is called, but it helps them when they're out in the water. And then with the exception, I would say, then the different colors you do see tend to be regional. Like, so sometimes like with snakes, we get a melanistic population where they're very dark or they're all black. I haven't encountered exactly that with amphibians, but I think you kind of get where I'm going. Like green frogs green frogs are hilarious. I mean, you can get green frogs that are blue. And that's more in an individual case by case basis. They're not changed. I don't believe they're changing colors. But yeah, so the frogs we'd be encountering around here for the most part, going to be a pretty, they're going to be a pretty uniform, not uniform, a standard color.
So the ones you're seeing that are oddballs are just either probably like a, I don't know if mutation is the right word, or adaptation or something like that, depending on, because I remember seeing a picture, it wasn't too long ago, it had to have been a year or two ago, of that bright blue bullfrog that someone had caught in Ohio. And it was like a viral story that it was like a 1 in a million blue frog, or whatever. But it was a cool looking frog, and it didn't look edited. It looked like, this is probably some sort of color mutation or something, kind of like an albino frog would be. Mm-hmm. Are there any other of those kind of oddball mutations or anything that you see? Maybe not even so oddball, just common. I know you mentioned darker, which makes sense.
Yeah, it's the most common thing that I've seen with green frogs, and I guess bullfrogs, where you just get, some of them will be a lot more brown, muddy colored. Others are green. They just kind of run the gamut, but in general, they're still like this kind of just greenish brown drab top with a creamy kind of bottom. But yeah, you get those rare ones, and the blue one, I actually got the amphibian book in front of me. I was going to try to find the green frog chapter, because I think they've got a collage of green frog pictures that it varies, but it's not like it's I guess it's not like we see with mustelids, like your mink and your weasels, where they change coat based on the weather. This is more like regional differences, and then oddities, either mutations or that 1 in a million albinism, or something like that.
So earlier you said a word, and I can't remember what the word was, but when you were talking about a frog getting ready for mating, and it was some word where you kind of hinted it was like them making their nest or bustling around or something like that. What does a frog do during mating season, or what I guess common behaviors are they doing to get ready for, because like in a bass's world, right? A bass goes up shallow, it makes a bed, you can kind of see the bed, it's got an area, a territory that it's guarding, it fans it out. What are some of the things that frogs are doing during mating season? So
the frogs, I think I was talking about the bullfrogs. They kind of like set up their territory, and they either chutter-um.
That's what it was.
Oh yeah, that's not a scientific word. That's just a sound they make.
Okay, got it.
The jug-a-rum. Sorry. When they're ready, when they're breeding, they're advertising. So that's one of the best ways we survey frogs are through frog call surveys. So you just go out and you listen, and their peak is in the spring, because that's when they're advertising. That's the males trying to attract females, and so you'll get a lot of that early on, like you can with the wood frogs, spring peepers. Those are pretty, and the chorus frogs, those are pretty early in the spring. The toads then are kind of like next; they're really kind of shrill. Then you got your green frogs and your bullfrogs. And I feel like, in my experience, being out in the wetlands and stuff, your frog calls really kind of die down. Say June. It's not uncommon to hear like a bullfrog or a green frog, throughout the year. but your big choruses are definitely up front. And, that's when they're going to be a little bit more risk prone. They're out, they're displaying, their throat fills up, they're making noise. And so that's when they're there to breed and replace themselves. So, a lot of species, they throw caution to the wind. And that's when that will be a more vulnerable time in their life.
Yep. And that's what, obviously, one of the questions I'm probably going to ask on all of these species is the mating season, because of what you hinted at, right? It's the time of year where almost everything in the animal kingdom goes stupid. It lets its guard down. It's the reason that, old boy, the deer back here is up on the wall, right? It's because, again, It's just that time of year where all of your defense mechanisms, all of your street smarts, all of everything that you've done gets thrown out the window. And then when we're trying to imitate those certain species, obviously we want to know the time of the year, what they're doing, so we can imitate that, because it's probably just a feeding frenzy on these things, because again, they're letting their guard down. So really quickly then, I know, again, we know the basics of what habitat that they're looking for. We obviously see a lot of frogs around us as anglers. We're throwing them around huge lily pads, around vegetation, things like that, a lot of weed heavy stuff. But the one question I wanted to ask was actually about the water source itself. So most of the frogs that I see are around stagnant water. I don't really see frogs a ton around the heavy parts of our river system that we fish, where there's a lot of current. Even in the back eddies and the stuff like that, they just seem to avoid the heavy current, and you see them more in these, kind of like you hinted at, right? It's the drainage ponds, it's the that kind of stuff. Is that true for the most part, that these kind of frogs and this kind of stuff will gravitate towards stagnant water most of the time?
Yeah, I mean, and stagnant in the terms that it's like, it's not moving. Not like, I think, partly when I think stagnant, I'm thinking like gross water, but just, not like, those fast flowing streams, they're not good for the egg masses. They're going to get blown around. They want them to be solid on something, and they stick to stuff. So, so your drainage ditches, your borrow pits, your ponds, things that don't have a whole lot of flow is generally where we're going to expect to see these. Now, there are exceptions to that, because I've been, by creeks and that kind of thing, and seen frogs jump in, but I think those are more of like the odd man out, rather than, most of them you're going to find around these big bodies of, reliable water.
Got it. Well, let's switch to your favorite of these four, I believe, and that's going to be snakes. So obviously, I know that snakes will get eaten by bass. I've seen, a snake down a bass's gullet before. I've seen snakes, early morning doing their swim across the water, and then all of a sudden, bowling ball gets dropped in the water and something's coming up after them. So I know that bass will eat snakes, but I honestly don't know too much about the snake side of this equation. So for starters, luckily you're in my area ish, around here in the Midwest. So I think you kind of know where I'm coming from. Most of the time when I'm around a body of water, the three snakes that I'm seeing most of the time: water snakes, like your common water snake, your garter snakes, and then queen snakes. Is that fair to say for the most part? Queens are kind of, here or there miss, obviously, but water snakes, garter snakes, obviously are your top two of those three.
So your water snakes and your garter snakes are going to be your main ones. And that's usually, I've got a pond up here where we've got a rare snake species that we survey. And that's pretty much what you see in the area. These are water snakes and garter snakes, right? We're right in the Maumee. We've got cover boards. Those are the species we find. Those would be the some of them that and again, it's going to be region dependent. There might be other places. Like have queen snakes, ribbon snakes, that kind of thing. But
for the two main ones there, for garter snakes and water snakes, can you help us understand, I guess, biologically the main difference between those two?
Garter snakes tend to be a little more terrestrial, so they're both what are called in this natricine group of snakes, which are generic water snake terms. Then you've got the garter snakes, which are your Thamnophis versus your Neurodia, and so it's mostly prey and habitat. So garter snakes will be near water, but they're mostly going to be eating invertebrates. They'll occasionally eat other things. Like I've seen pictures of garter snakes with like sparrows in their mouth, or bigger ones eating frogs and whatnot. But for the most part, their diet consists of invertebrates and that kind of thing. Whereas the Neurodia, the water snakes, they are very predominantly fish and frog eaters. I guess the garter snakes do occasionally eat some smaller frogs, but and then the water snakes are obviously going to spend more time in and around water. So I mean, I used to work on Beaver Island in Lake Michigan, and you could walk the shoreline, and there's just hundreds of water snakes. Whereas the garter snakes are more inland. So you get places where they overlap, but in general, the water snakes are what you think of. They'd be more inclined to be on the water. Specialized hunting for this fishing. It's actually pretty cool. Grad student friend of mine, when he was doing his master's work, some water snakes, they do lingual luring. So to catch these, to lure in minnows, they flick their tongue out and they like tickle it across the water, and the fish kind of like come in, and then they'll bite the fish. It's
what?
Yeah. It's there's some pretty cool videos on his website. Lingual luring. If you get a chance to look at those, it's I think it was with the northern water snake. He might have looked at it with some other species. I can see if I can find you a link here.
That is wild.
Yeah, but the water snakes are more specialized for hunting of these fish. If you look up lingual luring on water snake, there's some video hits that it's pretty cool. It's pretty wild.
Lingual luring. I'm putting this in my my bookmarks for later. Lingual luring water snake. That's cool. So then, as far as the life cycle of a snake, so again, nothing super crazy there in terms of like metamorphosis or anything like that. Nothing crazy going on, but specifically for water snakes, because again, I think we're talking pretty aquatic here. When I see a snake, say I see a snake that looks fairly juvenile in maybe the 12-inch range, how old is that snake, or how far along in its process is a snake, say maybe like a foot long or smaller?
So if you're talking like water a foot long or smaller, I'd say if you're talking garter snakes and water snakes, that's minimum of a year old.
Okay.
So obviously, the water snakes, we were talking about differences. The water snakes tend to get bigger. So they come out of different sizes. But if I were to find about a foot long water snake, I'd assume that one has at least been around for about a full year.
Okay.
Same with garter snakes, they tend to be a little bit smaller. So that size, you might be talking 1 to 2 years. And then as with the problem with ectotherms is they grow depending on how much they're eating and how warm it is. So, you could have a 5-year-old snake that's only a foot long, but in general, I think you'd be talking about, you could at least a year old.
Got it. So as far as their motion goes, their motion interests me, obviously. Watching these snakes swim across water is super cool. They have that long, curvy, obviously S shape as they go throughout the water. It's mesmerizing to watch. And I think what's interesting on our end as anglers is a lot of our topwater lures do what we call walking the dog, right? We're going back and forth, and it's like we call them spooks, but it's just this long, almost dowel rod looking thing. It's like, 4, 5, 6 inches long, and you'll snap it with your rod. And as you snap it, the head on this thing darts kind of like back and forth like this, and it's called walking the dog. And it very much reminds me of how a snake naturally moves throughout the water, because again, that same wake that it's putting off of looks like the wake of a snake. So I think that's kind of interesting. I think that's where we get a lot of that motion. But one of the things I'm curious about is we see these snakes, you'll see them, kind of doing their S waver across the water, and then you'll spook them or something will happen and they'll dive. When they dive, and again, who knows if we know this or not, are they doing sort of that same motion in the water, just sped up, or do they dart, or does anything change when they go subsurface, I guess?
Not really. So we've got a tank here with some water snakes. You can see them, and I've been able to, the limited times I've been able to follow snakes with my eyes when they dive down. They're doing that same kind of motion. That's how they propel themselves. They're doing this. The serpentine, when they dive, it's kind of like they go straight down, but they're still doing that serpentine to wherever it is they're going to go hide.
How long can they stay underwater?
It's going to depend on the size and the species. But I wouldn't put it past, bigger ones to stay under for, 10 minutes or more.
Wow.
But again, that's one I don't know off the top of my head. So I'd have to look that one up to be for sure. But I'm always amazed at how long things can hold their breath when they want to.
Right. We have lungs that are the size of, 20 of these snakes, and we can hold our breath for a minute, and they can be underwater for 5 to 10 minutes. It's nothing. So as far as the appearance of snakes, that's one of the things that always kind of blows my mind a little bit too, is snakes. I can look at 2 different water snakes around here, and they can look, obviously you can tell they're both water snakes, but they can have nuances to them, different patterns, and they can look fairly different from snake to snake. Is there anything to those differences? Like as far as say two water snakes with, slightly different patterns to them, is that like a difference in, I don't know, subspecies or however that works? Or is it pretty much just like, I don't know, snowflakes, fingerprints, where every snake is a little bit different, and quit overthinking it, dude?
Yeah. So I think in terms of like the snakes that we're talking about here, our water snakes generally have, I have to look this up here. I think it's a crescent moon pattern, or I'm trying to remember. It's like when you look at their belly, I'm like, oh, that's clearly water snake belly. But then for the life of me, I can't remember what it looks like off the top of my head here. But I think that's different. It's going to be slightly different from your other snakes. So like your garter snakes generally have a pretty uniform belly. So I'd almost say, the northern water snakes, that kind of like breaks up the that white belly to me would, I guess it's that counter shading. But yeah, the water snakes to me, if I'm a fish looking up at it, it almost breaks it up. And so it would be less of a target. Let me see here. I'm looking at, so if I remember correctly, they've got like this brownish to reddish crescent moon pattern going down the ventral side.
One of the last questions on the patterns too. Is there anything pattern wise or color wise or appearance in general, other than size, that reflects that a snake is in a juvenile stage versus like a mature snake? Like, is there anything, do they change color at all, or is it literally just this snake is pretty much just getting larger with the exact same patterns, exact same colors?
So again, that's going to be species dependent. With the water snakes, I can say that the young are usually a little bit more bright. Those like a lot of the water snakes I see, it's like brown on brown. But when they're young, it's more like light tan and kind of brickish red.
Okay.
So they're a little bit more, their colors kind of pop a little bit more when they're smaller.
Got it. Which is obviously to us as bass anglers interesting, because I would assume if we're trying to mimic any sort of, a topwater snake imitation or something, you would probably want to mimic a more vulnerable, more juvenile snake in terms of pattern. So again, one of those things, it's just we're probably overthinking to the moon, but while we're talking about it, we might as well ask. No,
and I get, because I started, I've never really considered much of this the lure science, and I started looking stuff up, and it's really kind of hard to figure out where that nice balance is of mimicking the natural without like, hand painting with a magnifying glass to
right.
So I think the big things, your size and your motion would be where you'd go, and then like that same kind of like counter shading you'd see naturally. I wouldn't, I'd be curious to see if a fish prefers a speckled stomach over a plain white, garter snake versus water snake. But at the end of the day, these things are predators. Food is food. And I don't think anything's going to say, no thanks, I'll pass on that snake today because it doesn't have the right stomach pattern.
That's what's always hilarious too. We'll sit here and have this conversation, for 30 minutes to an hour about all these nuances, and then we'll go out and we'll catch a fish, the biggest fish of the week, on some chartreuse and pink. Like, it's but it's nice to have in your back pocket. It's nice to understand this kind of stuff. And obviously there's a time and a place for obnoxious and not natural, especially, when water clarity and that kind of stuff comes into play. But as far as mating goes with snakes too, a process I am super not familiar with is the mating process of snakes. I guess for us as anglers, all we probably need to worry about pretty much is what is happening in or near the water. Does any of that process at all for a water snake or a garter snake or anything like that happen in or around water that we should know about, or is all of that pretty much land driven?
I'd say garter snakes, it's land driven. Probably with most of the water snakes too. I feel like you might see them like chasing each other around in the shallows, but not a whole lot of it's not going to take place in the water to the extent like you would see with amphibians. If it's in the water, it's more likely just a happy accident. They're more likely to do, because a lot of these things have these elaborate courtship displays or, courtship in general. So snakes, they intertwine, they wrap around each other. And then, copulation can take quite a while depending on the species. So they'd be pretty vulnerable when they're in the water. So if they're doing that in the water, I'd say that's probably, again, it's a happy accident for the fish anyway, where it's likely to take place on land.
Got it. And then last question on snakes too. Any snake that is aquatic or swims or is going to be around water, is there a time of day, a time of year, anything like that will drive snakes to water versus land? Is there any rhyme or reason to that at all?
So obviously, I think during the drier times of the year, you're more likely to find, especially like your garter snakes that usually might be more terrestrial, down by the water's edge. Water snakes are pretty consistent. I do, in general, snakes, they're reptiles, their activity patterns, like at least up here with our experience with turtles, snakes, things kind of peak from like May to June. And then July, August, it's kind of a lull. And then things will pick back up in September as you've got your young of year that are either hatching or, developing. And then everything's making like one last push to get all the nutrients they need before they overwinter. So, September, right around now into October would be another time where I, keep my eyes peeled for, snakes on the move. But yeah, spring when they're most active, they're probably like a lull. But it's one of the things that fascinates me with like thinking about this is, as mimicking, snakes as lures or any of these species as lures is, maybe trying them during those lulls because it's more of like a novelty or a treat,
right.
The
I found a real dumb one.
Yeah. Well, yeah, like I'm not, it's like seasons of fruit, like, oh man, like, it's, all of a sudden you get grapefruit when it's not grapefruit season. You're like, oh man, this is awesome.
That's a good point.
Yeah, it could be worth trying, like, being aware of the seasonality of their natural history, honestly, using those lures when they typically be inactive might actually work in your favor because it's like I said, it's not something they're used to seeing right then.
It's a good point, right? Anytime we're talking about the times to target, the fun part of this conversation is the exact opposite of the answer that you or I or someone gives. Is the exact opposite also going to be a great time to try that?
So, exactly. Yeah. I think that's got to be part of the fun of this is trying to figure out what lures work, where and like I said, even the locality, because there are with a lot of these species of reptiles and amphibians. They can be locally abundant, and so what works in one pond might not work in a pond a few miles over, and I think that's got to be half the fun.
And it is, and even bigger picture, the fun of this is you hinted at it earlier, and you're 100% right. Is 99% of this equation is that bass are opportunistic feeders. They are predators. They see something that looks vulnerable, and that little switch goes off in their brain, and they attack. But the fun part about this is obsessing over that other 1% that may or may not give you like that slight little edge where it's like, okay, I feel like I understand something. So that's angling in general. So you definitely get it. And there's stuff in here we've talked about where it definitely shows, obviously, the understanding when you're talking about something like a snake, or in a minute we're going to talk about turtles. Frogs too, for instance. Anything that is going to spend primarily a lot of its time at the top of the water column, all we really care about is the appearance of the belly. Yeah. All we care about. That frog lure that you're throwing could be hot pink on the top, and I do not care if it's a natural kind of tanny green, or if it's like a black or something like that. Great. The rest can be whatever. You can have it highlighter colored on the top because it doesn't matter. So yeah, it's always the fun of these conversations. So let's move to salamanders. Salamanders, we'll hit these very quickly. I don't know a ton about salamanders except for the ones I've stumbled on as I'm tromping around in the creeks and stuff like that. We throw soft plastic lizards a lot of times, and we'll get to it in a minute, especially around spawn time. They seem to work well. But for first off, what are some common salamanders that we might see around here, like in the Midwest? Because when I think of salamanders, I think of these like ridiculous colored, black with bright pink or yellow dots or whatever, or orange bodies, bright orange or stuff like that. But then the ones that I've seen out, again, in actual person, just kind of being this sort of mud-colored little squiggly guys that I see when I flip over a rock or something. So what are some common salamanders that we might run into around these parts?
So we're pretty much split up into like the mole salamanders, which are going to be like your tiger salamanders, your blue spotteds, your spotted salamanders. Those are like the ones that I think people are most familiar with. And those do have some like the brighter colors. So they're going to be like a very dark body with bright yellow spots or bright blue spots. Then you've got your plethodonid or your lungless salamanders, which I think are probably what people are more used to encountering, like your mole, your redback salamanders. like your cave salamanders, that kind of thing. So if you flipped over a log in, Northwest Ohio, chances are a redback salamander is what you've encountered. They can get to be anywhere from towards 3 to 4 inches long. They usually have a red stripe on their back, but they can be gray, just brown, pretty drab.
Okay.
And so those are but you might also find like your tigers, your other salamanders. It's going to vary regionally. That's kind of the punchline for all this.
So where do mud puppies, as us rednecks down here call them, where do those play into this conversation?
Yeah, no, okay. So I always fear about mud puppies. So those are maybe more of like your stream salamanders. But okay. I also hear they like deeper water. So we did some mud puppy surveys here in the Maumee because they used to be here. Those rocky kind of like outcropping areas, kind of like they're wannabe hellbenders. If you're familiar with those. But I think the most reliable source I've heard from mud puppies are ice fishers who are, they've got something down 50, 100 feet deep and they get a mud puppy. They're kind of the weird ones where they're most active. Like the best time to trap for them is December through February. Like they're a weird salamander.
That's very interesting because the only place that I've we've seen them or someone's actually caught or snagged one or something like that is in the wintertime. We fish around here for like saugeye and walleye a lot around big discharge dams. So like the dams on I'm from Washington Courthouse, Ohio, so like Deer Creek Dam and stuff like that. These big dams coming out of like a state park lake, the spillways. That's where you're seeing a lot of these. And again, it's the deeper water in the area. It's cold, and that's the time you usually see a rogue one get caught by a cat fisherman or something from time to time. So that's always interesting. But those are technically salamanders, right?
Yep.
Okay.
And they're one that always confused me getting into this, because I grew up thinking reptiles, amphibians they need warm weather, and then you got these mud puppies where like I think their breeding season or their most active is like those winter months where that's when they're doing their thing.
They're just the antithesis of the regular salamander.
Yeah, they're definitely cold adapted. But yeah, so those I forgot about mud puppies, but yeah, those are the ones you'd mostly be seeing.
So are any of these that you talked about or that you mentioned a few minutes ago, are any of those poisonous around here? Because when I think of brightly colored amphibians or whatever, right, I think of poisonous. It's just where your mind goes. You've been taught all the time that bright frog from your zoo book when you were 8 years old is poisonous.
Yeah. So again, the amphibians, they all have those poison glands, so they're all poisonous to some degree, but it's more likely a taste thing, So
okay.
The best example is if you've seen toads, they've got those big lumps behind their eye. Those are called the parotid glands. Those are like toads, the bumps on toad skin, those are the concentrations of those poison glands. Whereas on your other amphibians, like your frogs and your salamanders, they're more evenly distributed throughout the skin.
So none of the salamanders around here are going to be dangerous to handle at all or anything like that?
No. And if anything, it's more dangerous to handle them, So like I said, a lot of these amphibians they've got permeable skin. So anything you have on your hand, like bug spray, if you got bug spray on your hand, you pick up an amphibian, it's probably not going to like kill them outright, but it's not good for them. That's why, in our field of herpetology, we have a habit of, rinsing your hands off in whatever water you have, or even whatever water like they might be in before you pick them up. But yeah, so it's not going to be like, you don't have to be afraid of picking them up, but
but also not the best thing for them. Right.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So what kind of habitat are these salamanders living in? Because you obviously hinted at the mud puppies that I brought up are kind of the opposite of where these are. They're not in the deeper water stuff. So where are you seeing your highest concentration of these more normal salamanders around us?
So salamanders are really interesting when I started thinking about it from a bait perspective, because most of the salamanders I've experienced with are your pond breeding salamanders and like vernal pools. So when we do salamander surveys, one of the things you're looking for a lot of these salamander species are ponds that don't have fish, because fish will eat the eggs. So you'll tend to find these mole salamanders, like these tiger salamanders, these spotted salamanders, make these early spring migrations, even earlier than I'm used to with reptiles. So I think their surveys start in April, where, you're looking for these vernal pools that have collected water. But, presence of fish is usually you'll find these intermediate areas where you might have some small fish and salamanders, but in general, they like these fish-free areas because the fish will just, gobble up their eggs.
Interesting. Yeah. So again, it's one of those things where these are maybe on the delicacy menu for, because again, it's going to be one of those things that's not super common, like you're saying, in a lot of these bass-heavy fisheries, whether it's a pond. Do you find them in bigger areas like lakes and big state park lakes and stuff like that too?
Yeah. So there's it wouldn't be unheard of. I think you're mostly going to find these things more terrestrially. Some of them will be along stream sides, because there's like a whole group of like the stream side salamanders or cave salamanders that might be down there. But there's the newts that I think would be the more common aquatic one, and they kind of do the backwards thing where they've got a red eft stage and their newt stage. But when they're on land, they're bright red. They're like nothing you've ever seen. They're pretty cool. It's called the red eft. And then the adult, I think it's the adult form, is the actual newt, which is what most people are used to seeing, that paddle tail. I would say the newts are going to be your more aquatic, and that'd be more what you'd be likely to see in these bigger bodies of water, and those are going to be kind of an olive greenish color. They've got little red dots, and like I said, that very stereotypical like paddle tail.
Got it. So one of the questions that I want to ask too, because I hinted at it earlier, is we use one of the oldest bass lures in the history of the world is that soft plastic. Well, not history of the world, but lately in modern bass fishing, a very popular lure is a soft plastic lizard. Zoom has made $1 billion, I'm sure, off of the soft plastic lizards over the past probably 10, 20, 30 years. But the time of year that it just absolutely shines is around the bass spawn. We'll throw these on bass beds, and there's just something about that profile of a, I was thinking salamander, but it may be a newt, it may be whatever it is that just poses, I don't know, that instinct goes up in a bass where you could throw a worm-style bait, a stick bait, you could throw a creature bait or something. Once you get that lizard profile, there's just something about it. A lot of times it'll flip these fish that wouldn't bite for the past 30, 40 minutes as you're bed fishing them. Do any of those that we talked about, whether it's salamanders or newts, do any of those pose a natural threat to bass eggs or fry? Like, I know obviously you hinted that bass pose a threat to the salamander on the flip side, but does that go both ways? Do a salamander or a newt pose a threat to bass eggs?
That's interesting, given what you just said and their response, because that was the only thing I could come up with. I would say in general, if they do, it's negligible or very small. Because your newts you're talking like 3 to 4 inches long, so they don't have much in the way of defenses. So I don't think they'd be like raiding nests, but like what is a common theme here, they're not going to say no to it. So I'd have to look that one up. That maybe
and they're and again, they're in that stage where they're protective in general of their bed, but a lot of times that lizard profile. So I didn't know if a newt will naturally consume bass eggs given the chance. I didn't know if that fit its food chain at all or not. Or maybe, again, like you said, this all comes back to that other 99% of bass behavior, which is I'm in whether I'm in a feeding stage or whether I'm in a protection stage, it's primal and I'm protecting my nest. So again, we overthink this a billion times, but I didn't know if any of those would eat bass eggs.
Huh. I'm sure they wouldn't say no, but I guess I wouldn't imagine them being like a main predator. I guess
interesting.
But off the top, thing about it, I don't really know what newts eat other than small insects. I imagine like everything they wouldn't, if they can get a fry, then they're not going to say no to it. I'd have to look into it. I'd be really curious to see if they get into bass nests. That's pretty interesting. But off the top of my head, I don't know for sure.
Again, probably if they do, it's not the reason that newt shaped baits work so well, right? It happens so little that's probably not the natural reason why a bass responds to something of that profile. Okay, so the last thing on our list here is turtles. So turtles, again, are one of those things that I think when you talk to someone normally and you're like, a bass eating a turtle sounds like the most ridiculous thing in the world, but they do. They most definitely eat turtles, especially in the juvenile stage. Those smaller turtles, again, we've said it probably 2 or 3 times at this point in this episode, but if a bass can fit it in its mouth, it will go after it, and it will give it the good old college try, whether it works out or not. It will try to eat it. So the species around here or around a lot of the United States, I think I see, or at least I know of, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm definitely not an expert on this, is like I've heard box turtles, painted turtles. I don't know if those are the same thing or not, but it seem to be fairly smaller turtles. And then obviously I know we have snapping and soft shell turtles that I've had not fun run-ins with either one of those before. But are there any other common turtles around here that we should probably be familiar with?
So I'd say box turtles. There are only truly terrestrial species of turtle. So I would almost take them off the list.
Got it.
They'll be in there on water sometimes, but they're not your aquatic ones. Your main aquatic ones, yeah, your painted turtles, red-eared sliders. They're not native.
Okay.
Your snapping turtles, soft shells. We have blandings turtles periodically. Your map turtles are another one. If you're in some of these flowing streams, like the Maumee, the map turtles are going to be those ones you see just piled up on each other. But I said the ones you're most commonly going to encounter are your snapping, painted, map turtles, and then some places stink pots are another one.
One of the things about soft shell turtles I wish somebody would have told me back in the day was how darn long their neck is, because the very first time I got bit by a soft shell turtle, I thought I was in the like no danger zone of getting bit by this turtle, and then it giraffe necked itself out and bit my hand. Of the two, obviously, snapping turtles, soft shell turtles both can bite, can be fairly aggressive. Are any of the other ones that you mentioned aggressive at all?
No, I mean I've been bit by more painted turtles than I have snapping turtles.
Okay.
Just because, but they get ornery, and that's because we're handling them.
There's nipping.
It might break the skin, but it's not gonna really ruin your day. But yeah, no, for the most part, the rest of them, they don't. Their main defense is hiding or tucking in their shell.
So I said it. I would like to hear your opinion on it too. But for a bass to take down a turtle, obviously for the ones that I'm thinking of soft shell, snapper, stuff like that. They would have to be, again, fairly in their juvenile state. Are any of those others that you mentioned small enough where you think a normal sized bass could take down an adult?
An adult? No. I mean, once they reach adulthood, that shell's me pretty hard to digest. Not impossible.
Okay.
Because the ones we listed off, even the painted turtles and the stink pots, which would be the smaller ones, their shells are going to be on the stink pot. Going to be like 4 to 5 inches. That's going to be a not impossible. I mean, I'm sure someone's probably got some story of finding a bass with a pretty sizable turtle in there. But in general, they're going to be hitting those juveniles because. When they come out of the egg, they're about the size of a quarter. I've got a bunch down in the lab. And those shells, they have shells, but they're still pretty soft up until about, I'd say, that first year. The shell has a lot of flex.
Okay.
And so that's when they're young, they're inexperienced, they're on the move. And that's when they're going to be the most vulnerable. And then it's this is when we start talking about getting into behavior and optimal foraging and things. You're always going to go over for the thing with it's this big with the soft shell versus this big in a hard shell. Right.
That was going to be my next question too, was how do they digest the shell? So that makes sense. So you said up until about a year time frame ish. That's at least. Yeah. I know it's still a defensive shell, but it's not as rock solid as we think of when we think of turtle shells.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's one of the things when I measure them in the lab, I have to be careful not to push on my calipers too hard because they're little shell flexes, and it's not going to hurt them, but I'm trying to get accurate measurements, and their shell isn't hard yet.
Are there any of those species you see that the shell is more soft or more malleable in that younger stage than others, or are they all pretty much fairly similar till they get to adulthood?
Obviously, the soft shells are going to be the odd one out.
Fair, yeah.
I would say your typical most of your aquatic turtles are going to be. Like your pond turtles are going to have like your painted turtles, map turtles. They're going to be about the same kind of like shell hardness, I guess. Snapping turtles, they come out a little bit more thicker and hard, but they're still, popcorn shrimp size, so they're easy to get down. If I were a fish and I had a choice, I'd go with the painted turtle over the small snapper. But again, their shell it follows the same rules. It's still not super hard there for a while yet.
As far as colors go, again, we talked about it a little bit ago, but top, what's probably on the shell or anything like that doesn't really matter to us. But from the bottom, do most of these species look fairly similar?
Yeah, so when they're that age, and that's actually one where it's easy not to get lost in the weeds there with lures and stuff. At that age, they don't really have, for the most part, they don't have a whole lot of pattern to that bottom of the shell. Painted turtles will have like a little black oval. Snapping turtles is usually pretty uniform. Map turtles have I think a circle in each one of their scutes, and like your Blanding's turtles just have some dark coloration. But in general, like a plain underside, I think would be the way to go. Because when you mentioned fingerprints earlier, we actually use turtle plastron patterns when they reach adulthood as a form of fingerprints, and it's unique to the individual. So, but I would never encourage anyone to get that detailed.
So then, as far as habitat goes for a lot of these turtles too, obviously I know we're talking about the aquatic ones here, but I see a lot of turtles, obviously, as you're going down the river in your kayak or whatever, they're sunning themselves. They're on wood structure a whole lot of times. There's a lot of times where I'm seeing the high concentration of a lot of these turtles. Do they tend to live around wood structure or structure like that, or do they live, I guess, probably closer to the bank or on the bank or somewhere else? Where are they making their, I guess, quote-unquote home?
So your pond turtles, like your painted turtles and your map turtles, the ones that you're seeing out there are basking. Even the snapping turtles, most of our turtle species spend majority of their time in the water. They'll come out to bask. Like you'll see on those logs, they're soaking up the sun. That's how they digest. That's how they get enough, energy. That's how they process energy to get going during the day. They're very temperature driven. But then they're going to tool around like a home range in the aquatic area, so they'll go on land to nest. But for the most part, they're going to be in the water. Free swimming, but any place with structure is always great because it's a great place to hide. You can bask, and then if you've got some structure in the water in terms of logs, branches, lily pads, whatnot, great places for them. If they see a heron come by, just dip in the water. They tend to go straight down and just hide there.
Last question on turtles. I have to ask it too, because again, we got to ask it for all four of them. But as far as mating goes, again, does any of that happen in or around the water, or any mating habits or behavior, anything like that we should be aware of?
Yeah. So the turtles, those aquatic turtles, those pond turtles, most of their mating is going to happen in the water. I don't think I've seen any of it happen out of the water. It's not to say you wouldn't see it, but yeah, so they have these elaborate courtship displays where they're chasing each other around. Early in the spring, you'll see them. You might see them copulating in the shallows and that kind of thing. Same thing with the snakes and frogs. That's when they're vulnerable. But those adult turtles, by the time they've reached reproductive age, I don't think they're worried about fish trying to pick them off.
Got it. Well, cool. That wraps us up. Obviously, all four there. Before we let you go, obviously, I know you're busy. We got to let you get out of here. But if someone is interested in learning more about what we just talked about, right, the herpetology kind of spikes their interest. Is there somewhere you would point them for good info or reliable info, or kind of a good resource to research a little bit of this more?
Yeah. So there's lots of you can find online, field guides, that kind of thing. For Ohio, we've got our Ohio Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation Group. We're a group of people. We have annual meetings. There's a lot of knowledge there, but there's literature as well. Ohio Biological Survey, they've published the Amphibians of Ohio, which is this massive tome. So if you're interested in replicating any part of a specific species life history, that's the place to look. It's got everything you would ever want to know about amphibians in Ohio. And they just actually right there, they just came out the reptiles book too. So yeah, they're a really good place. In terms of, I was trying to think about this today, finding those species that are around your area that might be, your unique neck of the woods. These apps like iNaturalist and HerpMapper, where at least HerpMapper, they usually protect the area because, we don't want to tell people this is where you can find this endangered species of turtle. They usually obscure it, but you can at least get an idea of what might be in your favorite fishing area. And then maybe that's like, okay, well, then maybe these are the species that I should be looking to, find lures that are more similar, rather than something that is mass produced, and like, oh, we don't even get this thing over here.
Right. Well, that's always the fun part too, is as anglers, a lot of times we'll nerd out on that kind of stuff with custom painting and things like that. So that's interesting. So you said iNaturalist and Herp. What was
Herp Mapper.
Herp Mapper.
They're good places that have a lot. There's the places where you can submit your sightings, which help people like me figure out where these things are. But then also they've got some maps of things that you'll find, especially if you're looking for certain species, like your water snakes, your salamanders, that kind of thing. Again, they obscure it to, I think, the county level. Okay. But you can kind of like it's part of the fun challenge there is then to figure out what might be in your neck of the woods.
Right, and there's nothing that can replace just boots on the ground. Go out and look and check it out for yourself. And like I said, everything we talked about pretty much today, for the most part, right, we're going to see a lot of this around here, and most of them are not going to pose a threat to you if you go out looking for them, unless you are mishandling them or doing something you shouldn't be doing. But correct, and as we do have venomous species in Ohio, depending on where you are, and my advice is to people, if you don't know, don't touch it. Right.
It's the easiest way not to get yourself in trouble.
Right. A lot of these things, I think, because people are just naturally scared of them, they get a bad rap. But again, if you don't go bugging them, they won't go bug you. It's the same for 99% of stuff in the world. But but yeah, I appreciate you taking some time to shine some light on some of these things too, because again, it's stuff where we've seen the pictures before of bass eating snakes or turtles or whatever, and we know that they do, but again, we don't take the time to really dive in and understand these different species and what we can learn from them. So thank you very much. I greatly appreciate it. Is there anywhere that folks can keep up with you if they're interested in keeping up with you at all?
The Toledo Zoo's webpage, and our Facebook and our social media sites, that's where we do, you'll hear a lot about our conservation programs, and what's most interesting to anglers, I would say, would be the lake sturgeon program. We got a release coming up here in October. If anyone's interested, we dump them back into the Maumee bucket by bucket. It's a pretty good time. And we got a lot of, our partner agencies who come the zoo's pages are the best way to keep up on the stuff that we're doing.
That's awesome. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is Dr. Matt Cross. Matt, thank you so much.
Yeah, not a problem. You have a good one.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to episode 4 of the Bait Breakdown, the reptile and amphibian episode with Dr. Matt Cross. I truly hope you guys have enjoyed this series. It was a ton of fun to make, and I really think the information in these 4 episodes is insanely valuable to us as bass anglers. These are hopefully conversations that we can now look back on, for years and years as a resource to better understand natural bass forage. So thank you guys for making this possible. Thank you for the great feedback that I've got from you guys from this series. You guys enjoyed it. It sounds like even more than I had fun making it, which is always the goal. So thank you guys for the support. I appreciate you guys. If you want to help us out, go leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Go subscribe on Apple, Spotify, iHeart, wherever you listen to podcasts. And we will see you next week for another brand new episode of Tackle Talk.